In the late fall of 1886, high in the Montana Territory, the men hauling freight past Silas's small plot of land saw something that made them stop their teams. They saw a man building a house made of sticks and mud and hides. It wasn't a cabin. It wasn't even a proper tent. It looked like a giant, messy beaver lodge, an absurdity. They watched him pack moss and earth into the gaps. They saw him piling brush against the low, curved walls. Silas worked alone, steady and quiet. The structure rose from the ground, low and round, with a strange-looking cone at the very top. The men laughed. They called it the smoke hole folly. They figured he'd lost his mind. And when the winter of 1887 hit, the winter they would call the Great Die-Up, that crazy mound of dirt and sticks would prove the difference between survival and surrender. It would hold a number so impossible, it forced every builder in the valley to question everything they thought they knew about staying warm. If you want to hear the temperature that made the territory's most experienced men go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet Cree man, a newcomer from the north, understand about cold that every settler in their thick-walled log cabins had missed? If you enjoy these stories of quiet competence, consider subscribing and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Silas wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 38-year-old man trying to keep his family from freezing to death for a second time. He had come down from the north, from the lands around James Bay, hired on as a tracker and guide for the territory's new survey office. His wife, Alara, had followed, bringing their 2 young daughters. They were given a small plot and a company shack, a hastily built board and batten box that was, by local standards, barely adequate. That first winter, the winter of '86, was their brutal education. It wasn't the deep, dry cold Silas knew. It was a damp, wind-driven cold that seemed to have teeth. Their shack was a thermal disaster. Wind didn't just whistle through the walls. It seemed to pass through them as if they weren't there. He burned through the company's allotment of cordwood by January. He spent his own wages on more, hauling it himself, splitting it until his hands were raw. He fed the small cast-iron stove every 2 hours, day and night. It didn't matter. The heat went straight up the stovepipe. The walls were always cold to the touch. Frost grew in crystalline ferns on the nail-heads inside the shack. His daughters, bundled in every blanket they owned, coughed through the nights. Hilara stuffed rags into the cracks around the windows and door, only to find them frozen solid by morning. They lived in a constant shivering twilight, huddled around a stove that consumed fuel with ferocious hunger, but gave back only a tiny circle of warmth. The shack never got above 40 degrees. On the worst nights, the water bucket next to the stove froze over. Silas watched the American settlers in their proud log cabins. They fared better, but not by much. Their cabins were symbols of permanence, of conquering the frontier. Thick, heavy logs, carefully chinked with mud and moss. They looked strong, they looked warm, but they weren't. He listened at the trading post. Men complained constantly, burning through 4, 5, 6 cords of wood, wives and children sick all winter, constant back-breaking work just to keep the inside of their homes from freezing. They blamed the wood, the stoves, the wind. They never blamed the cabins themselves. But Silas saw the problem. He saw it with the eyes of a man who had lived his entire life in a place where winter was not a season to be endured, but a state of being. The settlers were fighting the cold with mass. They believed a thick wall was a warm wall. But Silas knew that wasn't the whole story. He saw the moisture. He saw the steam from their cooking, their washing, their own breath condensing on those cold, solid log walls. The moisture worked its way into the chinking, into the wood itself, and then it froze. A damp wall is a cold wall. Ice conducts heat away from you, not toward you. Their cabins were slowly, invisibly, turning to ice from the inside out. They were trying to heat a refrigerator. He also saw the air. Their big, drafty fireplaces and stoves were powerful air pumps. They drew in huge amounts of cold air from every crack and seam in the cabin just to feed the fire. All that cold air had to be heated, only to be sucked right up the chimney. They were heating the entire Montana territory, one stove load at a time. His own people, the Cree, didn't build like that. They didn't fight the cold. They worked with it. They built small, but they built smart. They understood that a house wasn't just a box to keep out the wind. It was a system for managing heat, air, and moisture. One evening, watching Alara try to warm their daughter's feet by the stove, the decision formed. He would not spend another winter in a white man's box. He would not watch his family suffer because of pride or tradition. He would build what he knew. His plan was simple. He would build a mythigwam, a winter lodge. He would use the materials the settlers threw away or ignored: saplings, moss, earth, and the one thing they all cursed, the snow itself. The opportunity came in the spring. The survey office was done with its local work, and his contract was up. They let him keep the plot of land as part of his final pay. He had a little money saved, not enough for a proper cabin, even if he'd wanted one, but it was enough for what he had in mind. As soon as the ground thawed, he began, and that's when his neighbors started to stare. He started by choosing a spot sheltered from the north wind by a small rise and a stand of pine. He didn't clear the land flat. Instead, he used the natural contours. He spent a week cutting young lodgepole pines and aspen saplings, flexible and strong. He stripped them, leaving the bark on for protection. These weren't the massive 8-inch logs the settlers prized. These were 2, maybe 3 inches in diameter. To his neighbors, it looked like he was gathering firewood, not house poles. He laid out a circle about 15 feet across. Then he began setting the poles, digging their bases into the ground and bending them inward to meet at the top, lashing them together with strips of hide and cordage. Slowly, a dome-shaped skeleton took shape. It looked fragile, like a basket. Jedediah Thorne, the man who ran the sawmill and had built nearly half the cabins in the valley, rode by one afternoon. He reined in his horse, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Silas," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind, "that's no way to build. A frame needs to be square. It needs bracing. A good snow load will flatten that thing like a pancake." Silas just nodded, continuing to lash a crosspiece. "Just trying something different, Jedediah," he said. His voice was level, calm. Thorne shook his head. "There's the right way to build and the wrong way. That ain't the right way." He rode off, convinced he'd just seen a man building his own family's tomb. Once the frame was complete, Silas began on the walls. This was the part that truly baffled everyone. He didn't use logs or planks. He started with a layer of dried grass and reeds, woven through the sapling frame to create a thick, loose matting. Then came the second layer, hides. He'd traded for old, worn-out canvas from freight covers and supplemented them with deer hides he'd tanned himself. He stretched them tight over the frame, creating a weatherproof outer skin. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. Between the inner woven grass wall and the outer hide wall, there was a gap of about 6 inches. This was the core of the entire system. That gap would be filled, but not with solid material. It would be filled with the best insulator Silas knew, something that was free and everywhere, still air, and moss. He spent weeks gathering sphagnum moss from a nearby marsh, letting it dry. He and Alara began stuffing the space between the walls with it, not packing it tight, but loosely. The moss trapped millions of tiny air pockets. It was like building a house out of a down blanket. Still air insulates. Moving air at 40 miles per hour strips heat 20 times faster than still air. The settlers' cabins had moving air inside their walls, drafts. Silas was building a house with a thick layer of perfectly still air. He left a low opening for a door, covered with a heavy hide flap, and at the very peak of the dome, an opening for smoke. He didn't build a massive stone fireplace. Instead, he dug a small, shallow pit in the center of the floor. The floor itself was another layer of innovation. He dug down about a foot, laid a bed of gravel for drainage, then a thick layer of pine boughs, and finally, a layer of tightly stretched hides. The house was built into the earth, using the ground's stable temperature as a thermal battery. The final step was the one that earned him the most ridicule. He piled thick sod and earth against the outside of the lodge, up to about 3 feet. It sealed the base completely from any drafts. From a distance, it looked like the house was growing out of a mound of dirt. The total cost was under $20, 10 for the old canvas, a few more for cordage. The rest was labor and scavenged materials. Alara watched with a quiet anxiety. She trusted her husband, but she heard the whispers at the trading post. She saw the wives of the other men look at her with pity. One evening, as Silas packed the last of the moss into the walls, she finally spoke her fear. "Silas," she said softly, her hands twisting in her apron. "People are going to think we've lost our minds. They say it's a savage's hut." Silas paused. He looked at the finished lodge, then at her. He kept his voice low. "Let them," he said. "We're not building for them. We're building for us." The build was complete by late September, and when the neighbors saw the finished thing, they didn't see engineering, they saw poverty, they saw desperation, they saw a primitive structure that offended their sense of progress and permanence. The ridicule, which had been quiet muttering, started to get louder. It began with Jedediah Thorne. The sawmill owner felt a professional obligation to set things straight. He walked over one Sunday, his face set in a grim line. He circled the lodge, kicking at the earthen bank with his boot. "Silas, I came over as a neighbor," he started, not meeting the other man's eyes. "You got 2 little girls in there. When the wet snows come, that moss you got packed in there is going to get soaked. It'll rot. Worse, it'll freeze solid. You've built yourself an ice house. The weight alone will bring this whole thing down on your heads." It was a technical, specific objection. It sounded reasonable. It was the voice of experience. Silas listened patiently, his hands resting on his hips. When Thorne was finished, he gave a slow nod. "I appreciate the concern, Jedediah." He didn't argue. He didn't explain the breathable outer layer or the drainage. He just said, "We'll see how she holds." Thorne left in a state of high frustration. He'd tried to help. He told everyone at the trading post that the man was either dangerously stubborn or a fool. The story spread. The cruelest insult came from a freight driver named McCready, a big, loud man who liked the sound of his own voice. He was at the post, holding court for a half-dozen men when Silas came in for supplies. McCready saw him and bellowed, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "Well, look what the gopher dragged in! Silas, you still living in that mud pie you built?" The men snickered. Silas ignored him, got his flour and salt, paid, and left. The name stuck. From then on, it was Silas's Mud Pie. The gossip network was merciless. Women at the church quilting circle would ask Alara, their voices dripping with fake sympathy, if they were managing all right, and if they'd made plans for where to stay when the time comes. Men riding past their plot would slow their horses, point, and laugh. It was a spectacle, a daily humiliation. Alara felt the pressure most acutely. She had to face these people every day. One afternoon, her own brother, Thomas, came to visit. He worked as a clerk at the land office and had adopted the settlers' ways completely. He wore a starched collar and a worried expression. He took Silas aside. "Silas, you have to listen to me," he pleaded, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't the old country. These people have rules. They have ways of doing things. They look at your home, and they don't see a clever man. They see a poor one, a lazy one. People are going to think you're either scared of the work to build a proper cabin, or you're incompetent. Maybe both." This cut deeper than McCready's bellowing. This was family. This was criticism disguised as concern. Silas's face remained a calm mask. He looked his brother-in-law in the eye. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas. I'm trying to keep my family warm." Even the institutional authority weighed in. A surveyor, Mr. Evans, who had been Silas's former employer, stopped by. He was a decent man, but a man of books and instruments. He walked around the lodge, tapping the walls, peering at the smoke hole. "It's an interesting construction, Silas. I'll give you that," Evans said, stroking his chin. "But it's not in any manual I've ever seen. There are no building codes out here yet, but if there were, this wouldn't pass. I worry about fire, mainly. An open pit inside a structure made of grass and hides? The fire is small. The smoke hole draws well," Silas replied. That was all. He didn't offer a tour. He didn't defend his work. He just let the criticism wash over him. By November, not one person in the valley thought Silas had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own stubborn, primitive ways. He was an outcast, living in a dirt mound, a subject of pity and scorn. Alara was isolated, and his daughters were whispered about by other children. They were alone. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Silas right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1886 to 87 is still recorded in climatology archives. It wasn't just a cold snap. It was a geological event. It started with snow in late November, feet of it, burying the range grass. Then the temperature began to drop. December 8th, the thermometer at the trading post read -18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. A bitter cold, but manageable. December 12th, it fell to -31. The wind picked up, a steady, relentless razor out of the north. December 18th, it was minus 38 at dawn. Wind chills were estimated at below minus 60, and it just stayed there. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer never once climbed above zero. The snow, which had been fluffy, turned to a dry, crystalline sand that squeaked underfoot. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Metal became brittle. An axe handle, left outside, could shatter like glass. The valley began to break. The settlers' proud log cabins, which had seemed so robust, revealed their fatal flaws. They were hemorrhaging heat. The Colby Ranch, one of the biggest in the area, was burning 2 full cords of wood per month, and their large main house was barely holding 42 degrees. Men were spending every daylight hour felling and bucking wood, a desperate, losing battle. The suffering was specific and brutal. The Thorne family, Jedediah's own, had their chimney fail. The rapid cooling and heating caused the mortar to crack, and a blockage of creosote and ice filled their cabin with smoke. They had to spend a night huddled in their barn with the livestock. The Williams family, down the creek, ran out of dry, seasoned wood. They were forced to burn green pine, a wet, sappy wood that produces little heat and a great deal of smoke and creosote. Their cabin was a cold, stinking mess, hovering around 35 degrees. Their youngest son came down with pneumonia. Cattle, caught out on the range, froze where they stood. They were found weeks later, solid statues of ice. Families began burning furniture, fences, anything that would burn. Survival became a single, desperate calculation, BTUS. How many BTUS could you generate? And how many were the wind and the cold stealing from you every second? For most, the calculation was negative. They were losing. And then people started noticing the mud pie. At first, it was just small things. The freight drivers, pushing their teams through the brutal cold, noticed the smoke rising from Silas's lodge. But it wasn't the thick, panicked plume of smoke they saw from the cabins, a sign of a fire being desperately stoked. It was a thin, steady, almost lazy wisp of blue smoke. It was the smoke of a small, efficient fire, a fire that was just ticking over. Then a neighbor riding past saw Silas outside. It was a minus 30-degree morning. The neighbor was a mummy of wool and fur. Silas was outside splitting kindling. He wore trousers, moccasins, and a simple wool shirt, not a heavy coat, not even a hat. He didn't look like he was in a hurry. He looked comfortable. The sight was so jarring, so wrong. The neighbor thought he might be hallucinating. He hurried home. The strange image burned into his mind. A man in a shirt in the middle of the great die-up. It made no sense. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It would rewrite the rules of survival on the northern frontier. The breaking point for Jedediah Thorne came on December 23rd. He was on an emergency wood run. His sled piled high with cordwood he was selling at cost to desperate families. He knew Silas had no way to haul large amounts of wood, and he imagined the family must be freezing, too proud to ask for help. Motivated by a mixture of Christian duty and a grim need to be proven right, he guided his team toward the low mound in the snow. He pulled up, his beard a solid mass of ice. "Silas!" he yelled, his voice muffled by his scarf. The hide flap pushed open. Alara stood there. The warmth that billowed out of the opening was a physical shock. It hit him like stepping into a different season. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove. It was a gentle, steady warmth. It smelled of pine boughs and wood smoke, and cooking stew. Behind her, through the opening, Thorn saw the image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The two little girls were sitting at a small wooden table on the floor. They were playing with dolls, and they were wearing simple cotton dresses, not coats, not blankets, dresses. Thorn was so stunned he couldn't speak for a moment. He just stared. Elara waited patiently. "Everything all right, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice calm. I brought some wood," he stammered, gesturing to the sled. "Figured you might be running low." "That's kind of you," she said, a small, unreadable smile on her face. "But we're managing fine. Silas brings in what we need." Jedediah's mind was reeling. He was delivering wood to families burning half a cord a week just to keep from freezing. "How much are you burning?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Oh, not so much," Elara said. "The lodge holds the heat well, a little in the morning, a little at night. Silas says we use about what a small cook stove would." The statement was so contrary to everything he was experiencing, it didn't compute. He swung down from his sled, his legs stiff with cold. "I have to see," he said, more of a demand than a request. Elara stepped aside and let him in. He had to duck to enter. Inside, it took his eyes a moment to adjust to the dim light, which came from the smoke hole above and the soft glow of the fire pit. The air was warm and fresh. He looked at the fire. It was tiny, a few pieces of wrist-thick aspen, burning cleanly with almost no smoke. It was a fire for cooking, not for heating a house in a record-breaking freeze. It was impossible. His eyes darted around the interior. The woven grass walls were dry to the touch. The air didn't feel damp or heavy. His gaze fell upon a small mercury thermometer hanging from one of the frame poles. He walked over to it, his boots silent on the hide floor. He squinted in the dim light. The mercury sat clearly, unmistakably, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees. Let that sink in for a moment. Outside, the temperature was minus 39 degrees. With the wind, it felt like minus 70. Jedediah Thorn's own well-built cabin, with a roaring fire in the big stone fireplace, was struggling to hold 45 degrees. The impossible number wasn't the 68 degrees inside. It was the difference. A temperature differential of 107 degrees. Thorn reached out a bare hand and touched the interior wall. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even cool. It felt neutral, like a piece of furniture. He walked back to the thermometer, pulled out his own pocket thermometer, and held it up. He waited. It settled at the same mark. He couldn't deny it. The data was right in front of him. He turned to Silas, who had been quietly watching him. The questions came in a torrent. "How? The fire is nothing. The walls are sticks. This should be an ice cave." Silas gestured to the walls. "The walls aren't for strength. They're for holding the insulation, the moss, and the air gap. The heat from the fire hits the walls and stays. It doesn't escape." He pointed to the small trickle of melted water running down a stick near the smoke hole. "The lodge breathes. The moisture gets out. It doesn't freeze in the walls." Thorn began to put the pieces together. The snow that had piled up around the lodge wasn't a threat. It was more insulation. The earth banked around the base wasn't primitive. It was a perfect seal against the wind. The small fire didn't need to pump huge amounts of air. The whole structure was an elegant, efficient system for retaining heat, not for endlessly generating it. He looked at the tiny woodpile inside the lodge. It was maybe 2 days' worth for a normal cabin. For Silas, it was probably a week's supply. He did the math in his head. Colby Ranch, 2 cords a month, holding 42 degrees. William's cabin, nearly 2 cords a month, struggling to hit 38. His own cabin, 1.5 cords a month, holding 45. Silas's lodge, maybe half a cord a month, holding a comfortable 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. It was an order of magnitude more efficient. Jedediah Thorne, the man who had built half the valley, the man who knew the right way to build, stood in the gentle, quiet warmth of the mud pie. He looked at Silas's healthy, comfortable children playing in their dresses. He thought of his own wife and kids, huddled in blankets, their faces smudged with soot from a struggling fire. He was a proud man, a stubborn man, but he was not a fool. He walked to the door, turned back to Silas, and uttered the words that would echo through the valley for decades. His voice was quiet, rough with emotion. "We've been doing this wrong," he said, "for 50 years. We've been doing it all wrong." It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about dignity. The constant shivering struggle was gone. In Silas's lodge, children did their lessons without their fingers going numb. Elara cooked and mended in normal clothes. They slept soundly through the night, not waking to a freezing room and the desperate need to feed the fire. The system turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through. The story of Jedediah's visit spread faster than a prairie fire. It was too fantastic to be ignored. It came from the valley's most respected builder. Mr. Evans, the surveyor, heard the tale and arrived a few days later, this time with a calibrated instrument thermometer. He was the institutional skeptic, the man of data. He measured the outside temperature, -41. He measured the inside temperature, 67. He measured the temperature of the interior wall surface, the moisture content of the air. He filled a notebook with meticulous data. He, too, left in a state of stunned silence. The mockery died overnight. It was replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. Macready, the freight driver, fell silent when Silas entered the trading post. The pitying looks from the women turned into curious, questioning stares. The laughter was gone. In its place was the quiet acknowledgment of an irrefutable truth. The mud pie worked. Word spread. By the time the great freeze broke in mid-January, half the valley knew something impossible was happening in the Cree family's lodge. The adoption of the idea began not out of admiration, but out of desperation. The first convert was a young homesteader named Miller. His cabin was in a bad spot, exposed to the wind, and his wife had just given birth. Their newborn was in constant danger. His woodpile was nearly gone. He swallowed his pride and went to Silas. He didn't ask for a handout. He asked for knowledge. Silas didn't lecture. He walked with Miller, showed him how to build the frame, how to create the insulation cavity, what kind of moss to use. Miller couldn't build a proper lodge midwinter. Instead, he built a simplified version as a shell around his existing drafty cabin. He used canvas, packed with straw and piled high with snow. It was ugly. It was a temporary fix. But within 2 days, the temperature inside his cabin rose from 35 degrees to 55, and he cut his wood consumption by more than half. His baby was safe. This proved the principles were replicable. That spring, 7 families built their own versions of the lodge or used the principles to retrofit their cabins. 12 more built them that summer. By the following winter, nearly 20 families in the valley were living in structures based on Silas's design. They were called winter lodges or Silas houses. No one called them mud pies anymore. Mr. Evans, the surveyor, published a bulletin through the Territorial Land Office. It was titled, "Observations on Efficient Winter Shelter Construction in Northern Climates." It didn't mention Silas by name, simply referring to a design adapted from native construction. But it was filled with his data, the temperature differentials, the fuel consumption rates, the principles of breathable insulation, and thermal envelopes. The bulletin spread to other territories, and variations began to appear across the northern frontier. What Silas built in 1886 anticipated by nearly a century what modern building scientists would rediscover and call a double-wall system with a vapor-permeable exterior. He wasn't an inventor. He was a practitioner of a technology that had been perfected over thousands of years of survival in the coldest places on Earth. Years later, when his own daughters were grown, a young newspaper reporter came to interview him about the legendary winter of '87. He asked Silas if he felt proud of having taught the settlers a better way. Silas, now an old man with quiet, steady eyes, just shrugged. "This isn't new," he said. "It's just correct." The original lodge stood for 30 years, eventually being replaced by a small, well-insulated frame house that Silas built using the same principles. But for decades, hunters would point out the sunken circle on the ground where it once stood, a testament to a winter when conventional wisdom failed and ancient knowledge saved the day. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for tradition's sake. It rewarded what worked. In the end, the simple, undeniable physics of warmth, moisture, and air proved more powerful than prejudice. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for more stories of forgotten wisdom and proven frontier techniques. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of survival techniques. The specific characters, names, and dialogues are fictional, but the engineering principles and the historical context are based on real practices and events.